Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, at the Like Button's next birthday party, please gift them a 3-year supply of Radithor. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On Monday, May 23rd, 2005, 37-year-old John Wilson got home from a very long day at work and immediately just collapsed into a sofa. John was an oil pipeline inspector in Houston, Texas, and that day it had been extremely hot and he'd been driving around all these different job sites and he'd been out in the sun and he really hadn't had a break. And so now that he was home, he was totally exhausted and knew he should probably just go to bed, but he didn't want to. He didn't want to just go right to bed and then have to get back up again and go right back to work. He wanted to unwind before calling it a night. And so he decided what he would do to unwind would be to go fishing, something he really loved to do. Normally, John did a lot of freshwater fishing, but tonight he decided he would do some saltwater fishing. And so at about 7:30 p.m. that night, he grabbed his fishing rod and his tackle box, he threw it in the back of his pickup truck, and then he hit the road. About an hour and a half later, he had driven all the way south to the very coast of Texas to a beach called Crystal Beach, which is right on the Gulf of Mexico. And instead of parking in one of the parking spaces in the lot, John, like he always did, just drove right through the gate out onto the actual beach. This beach actually had a reputation for having really hard-packed sand, almost like cement, because so many people like John would drive their vehicles out onto the beach. And so he goes through the gate and he drives straight out towards the water. And although it wasn't completely low tide yet, it was making its way towards low tide. And so there was a lot of beach exposed. And so John drove for quite a while and then he parked still in the tidal zone, but well away from the water. John probably figured that he would not be there long enough for it to matter because high tide was not for several hours. And so John hops out of his truck, he preps his fishing rod, and he walks out into the actual surf and he begins to fish. And it would have been very, very peaceful as there was not really anyone else down there as it was pretty much the middle of the night. There might have been a couple other fishermen nearby, but that was about it. And for a while, John probably just enjoyed the peace and quiet. He enjoyed fishing. And then after a while, John got overwhelmingly tired. Maybe it was from all the work earlier in the day out in the sun that was just finally catching up to him, or maybe it was all the moving around in the surf, getting knocked around by the water that was making him tired, or maybe it was both. But either way, John decided he wanted to take a nap before he headed home again. And so he left the surf zone, he dropped his fishing rod in the back of his truck, and then he crawled underneath his truck to take a nap. The following morning, a man who was out for a walk near Crystal Beach looked out into the water and he saw a truck was half submerged in the surf zone. And so he called the police, and then the police called a tow truck, and then the tow truck driver showed up to the beach, and when he got there, it was still relatively high tide, and so he had to wait until it was low tide enough that he could actually attach the chains and start pulling this truck out of the surf zone. And so finally, when it was low tide enough, the tow truck driver walked down, and as soon as he was standing next to this partially submerged vehicle, he saw there was a body poking out from underneath it, and that body belonged to John Wilson. No one knows for sure what happened to John after he climbed underneath his truck. But the best guess is after he went under there, he fell asleep and he slept for longer than he anticipated. And in that time frame, even though the sand of this beach had this reputation for being really, really hard, well, after a couple of hours, his truck would have begun to sink in the sand. It would have settled into the sand. And so John, as he's laying there at some point, would have been trapped by the underside of his truck. And then from that point, either the truck just continued to settle, ultimately crushing John to death, or it kept him pinned there, but he was still alive, and then the tide came in and eventually he drowned. Either way, John's final moments must have been torture. Sevnica is a gorgeous town right in the heart of Slovenia, situated right along the Sava River, which is one of the longest rivers in Europe. The section of the Sava that flows past Sevnica was a popular destination for kayakers and canoeists up until 2008, when a hydroelectric dam was built across it, creating a sort of dead end for anyone trying to go through that section of the river. They would have to stop at the dam, get out, walk around, and then pick up the river on the other side, or or that would mark the end of their trip that day. In 2008, while this dam was still under construction, the mayor of Sepnica, who was in favor of the construction of this dam, he understood that this was kind of a bummer for the people in town. While the dam itself was going to provide more electricity for the town, it did kind of end an era. And so he decided he would organize a final trip down the Sava River past the dam while they could still go right past it. And he was calling this trip the Final Descent. And so he went all around town asking people if they wanted to come, and he finally recruited 27 other people to come with him on this final trip. And so a few weeks later, on July 3rd, after all preparations were made, the mayor and the rest of his crew, they made their way upstream to this loading area where 4 canoes have been set out for them. And the staff people that had actually provided these canoes, they offered the group life jackets, and virtually everyone in the group turned it down. It's unclear why they turned down the life jackets, but one could guess that, the river itself was incredibly calm and they were not expecting to be on the water for very long, and so they just decided they didn't need one. And so after all 28 people got into their canoes, 7 people per canoe, they pushed off the shore and they began their slow trip down the river. And the mayor had actually hired a photographer to come along with them to document their journey. So as soon as they take off, the photographer is looking around, taking pictures and filming. The weather was beautiful and the water was calm, and everything was just going really, really well. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their journey, they turned this corner and they got a clear view of the dam, which was about 1,000 feet away from them at the time. Now, the dam was not done yet, but it was pretty close to being done. And so the actual structure of the dam, it was built. And so even from 1,000 feet away, it was very obvious to tell that up ahead, there's these big cement archways where the water flows down over this dam. And the whole group pretty much immediately saw they had a problem. The plan, according to the mayor, had been they would get to this dam, but on the left side of the dam, there was going to be a strip of waterway that had not been blocked off yet. Because when this dam was complete, it would completely obstruct the river side to side. But because it wasn't actually done yet, the construction crew had told the mayor that, yep, the left side, there's going to be an area where you can basically just casually go right past. You won't go down the dam. It's totally safe. But here this group is on the water looking at the dam, and even from 1,000 feet away, it was obvious there was no side way to get around the dam. You clearly had to go through the dam, or you had to get out and go around the dam. Now, the river was moving very, very slowly. There wasn't a strong current, and so there wasn't some urgent decision that needed to be made about what they were going to do. The group intuitively knew that the right choice here is to, go to the side, get out of your canoes, and either go around or just end the trip right there. But the mayor and a few of the other people in the other canoes got the idea that, hey, why don't we just go over the dam? I know we're not supposed to, and the construction crew explicitly said, don't go over the dam, it's extremely dangerous. But from the looks of it, it doesn't look that bad. And truthfully, it did not look too bad. This was not some enormous dam with some huge drop off. It was actually a pretty small dam where the water kind of went down this fairly small embankment. It was maybe 10 or 15 feet long, and at the bottom of this embankment was some semi-rough water. But overall, it just looked like it might be kind of fun to go down this dam, like you'd be going down a slide with your canoe. And so the mayor was really keen on doing this. He made it seem like it was going to be fun, it was going to be an adventure. And so before long, 3 of the 4 canoes were fully on board with the idea of just going over the dam. The 4th canoe that was not prepared to go over the dam had the photographer in it. And they said, we're not comfortable with this, but we'll pull up next to the dam and we'll just film you guys going over the dam. It'll be really cool. And so after making their plans about who was going to do what, the 4 canoes continued down the river. And when they got about maybe 100 or 200 feet away from the entrance to this dam, the 4th canoe with the photographer pulled off on the left side of the river. They got out, and the photographer lifted up his camera and he began filming the other 3 canoes as they made their approach into the dam. Now, the video from this photographer that was released to the public, it shows the first of these 3 canoes actually going into the dam. And you see these 7 people on this canoe. They're kind of happy and excited looking. They have nervous anticipation, like they're about to start a roller coaster or something. And they're making their way into this dark section inside of the dam. They're basically going through the gates of the dam where they're going to go down this embankment. And as they go into the darkness, as you begin to lose sight of them, you see the back end of the canoe suddenly pops up because now they're going down the actual dam itself. They start sliding down, and then you hear someone in the canoe start to scream, and then it goes completely silent. and then the video just ends. That canoe, right after it slid down that downslope, it would reach the waters below, but the canoe would capsize, throwing everyone on board into the water. And these 7 people, they didn't even have a chance to catch their breath before they were sucked under. Not only because the water was rough at the bottom of the dam and kind of was churning and pulling them under, but also because this is a hydroelectric dam. And at the bottom of the dam, underneath the water where they were all these big openings to underwater tunnels. And these tunnels functioned like vacuums. It pulled water down inside and then ran the water past a turbine, causing it to spin, and that would generate the electricity. That's what the dam actually did. And so after the water was pushed past this turbine, it would be jettisoned out somewhere else downstream. Now, even though this dam was not fully operational yet, these tunnels and the turbines at the bottom of them, they were operational. So as these 7 people are dumped into these incredibly dangerous waters and they're getting pulled down towards these tunnels, the other 2 canoes, they have no idea what's going on with this first canoe. And so they just continue on and they go over the dam. The second canoe that went down the dam, they also capsized at the bottom. All 7 occupants were thrown out and they were sucked down underwater almost immediately. The third canoe that went over the dam, they did not capsize. And so after they cleared the dam and kind of paddled away, they began looking around for the other 2 canoes that should have already been down there. And there was nobody out in front of them. And so they turned around thinking maybe they're closer to the dam and they don't see anyone, but they see one of the canoes is completely flipped over and the other canoe has been broken apart in the churning waters right at the base of the dam. And they see the wood from this canoe just getting tumbled around. And so this third canoe immediately turns and tries to paddle over to the base of this dam to try to start pulling people out of the water. But when they get over there, there's no one there. The 14 people that had been in these 2 canoes, they're gone. Ultimately, 13 of the 14 people that fell in the water that day would perish, and one of the fatalities was the mayor. The only person who survived who fell in the water was actually the mayor's wife, who by some miracle managed to swim out of the grasp of these tunnels under the water and made it to shore. Over the next several days and weeks, police divers were able to eventually find all 13 bodies, one of which had traveled 25 miles away to Croatia. No information was given about the state of the bodies when they were found, and so we don't know if having been sucked down through these tunnels and forced past these underwater turbines played a role in their death. All the public knows is that all or most of these 13 people were sucked down into these tunnels and then they died. Full transparency, this next story was pretty difficult to put together because the details of what actually happened to the victim are just really difficult to decipher. And so I think I've been very thorough and I've done a good job describing what happened, but I'm willing to accept it if I'm not right and this is actually inaccurate. And if you think I am, feel free to let me know in the comments. With that said, here we go. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone landed what she considered to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at a brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle. They had converted it into a rotating stage, and they put up partition walls all along this rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages on this rotating stage. And so on each of these 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs about America. And so the way this would work if you were in the audience is you would walk into this theater that looked like a single theater with one stage right in front of you, but really what you were looking at is one of these 6 stages. And so the audience would sit down, they would see one of the acts, they'd see one performance on one of the stages, and then the stage would rotate. And so the audience would remain in the theater until all 6 stages had rotated in front of them and played their 2 to 4 minute long act. Debbie's job at America Sings was at the beginning of these shows where the audience would watch all 6 acts. She would go up before the very first act, she'd go on stage and she would greet the audience. And then the show would start, it would filter through all 6 of the stages, and then Debbie would get back on stage and she would say goodbye to that group of audience members. It was a simple gig and Debbie seemed to like it. And so on July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, and so it was 9 days after after Debbie had started her job, Debbie was asked to come in for an evening shift. And so she left her house and she made it out to the attraction at about 10 p.m., which was right at the start of a show. And so she went right inside, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage and the show began. And so over the next 30 minutes, all 6 of the stages performed their acts. And then after the 6th act was done, Debbie dutifully climbed back onto the stage. She said goodbye to the audience. And then as that audience was leaving the theater, she turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happened next requires some additional explanation. Each of the 6 stages that made up this attraction had a fairly tall back wall. And behind each of these 6 back walls that were kind of in a ring was the center of the actual attraction. And in the center was this circular, fairly tall storage room. This storage room did not rotate. It was stationary. These stages and their respective back walls, they rotated around this storage room. The gap between the outside of the storage room at any point around it and the inside of the back wall was maybe a couple of inches. It was pretty narrow, but it was big enough that a person in theory could get stuck back there. So it was a real hazard. However, Disney did not put any specific safeguards in place to prevent their staff from intentionally or unintentionally going into this space. They just told their staff to not go back there and be careful. So back on July 9th, after Debbie has said goodbye to the audience and she's walked towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage she's on to the adjoining stage. And when she does that, she either trips or falls or something happens which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the 2 back walls of the 2 stages she was on. And so she falls through that gap and then gets wedged between the outside of the storage room and the back of one of the back walls. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck. And so she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. None of the staff hear her, or they don't recognize that this is a real call for help. And this new wave of people that are coming in, the new audience, they're all talking loudly. There's music playing. They don't really hear her. And anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later say they thought it was part of the show. And so as Debbie is screaming bloody murder, she cannot get out of this gap, this narrow gap she's stuck in. These stages, they start to move because the show is going to start. And because Debbie has nowhere to go, when the stage began to rotate, she got forcibly dragged and twisted and rolled, and her body began to contort, and bones started to break, and she was forced to continue moving through this narrow space because the stage was just going to keep on going until it reached its next position. And so finally, after it dragged her all the way to its next position, Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. She probably had dozens of broken bones, but she was alive and she's still totally stuck and she's screaming with every ounce of energy she has. But again, the audience, even though they heard her screaming, they assumed it was part of the show. And apparently the staff also heard her screams and convinced themselves it was just no big deal. And so 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again. And so Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged and smashed and broken as the stage again rotates to its next position. And she's still not dead. She's screaming out for help. No one is coming to help her. And so the entire show would play out with the stage rotating through all of its sections. And then finally, at the end of the show, when one of the audience members alerted the staff that, hey, you should really go check out that screaming we heard. And at that point, they went for a look and they discovered Debbie, and she was very obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the America Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. On February 27, 2015, 18-year-old Dalen Pua was visiting his grandmother on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Dalen, who was a Hawaiian native himself, didn't spend much time in Oahu with his grandmother, and since he was here, he figured he would do the one thing he had always wanted to do, which was to climb the island's very famous and very illegal Haiku Stairs, or better known as the Stairway to Heaven. These stairs were a very narrow, rusty, not well maintained 4,000 step staircase that weaved its way up the side of this Hawaiian mountain. It was built during World War II by the United States Navy because they wanted access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and it was not well maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987 and literally put a fence up and even put guards out to keep people from going in. But Dalen really wanted to do this. So that morning he tells his grandmother that he's thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. And his grandmother's like, that's a horrible idea. Not only is it dangerous, but they're going to fine you thousands of dollars if they catch you doing that. Dalen backed down from what he said and he said, okay, I won't go. And he kind of played it off like, I'm not going to go on this hike. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and he made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal and he was incriminating himself, he was so excited about going on this hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. And so the first picture begins with him at the base of the stairs where he posts a picture as he's about to start this hike. And then all morning he's taking pictures along the way up these 4,000 stairs. But then around 11 a.m. that morning, the posting stops abruptly and he hasn't reached the summit. And you figure if you're going to do this hike and you're already posting pictures of just the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you're going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post all of those because that's the prize at the end of this hike. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly hadn't reached the summit yet. And by that night, when he didn't come home, the family was really concerned and they told police. Police launched this huge search for him. They're looking all over the stairs. They got helicopters out. The Navy gets involved. There's no sign of him. He's just vanished. When they couldn't find him after several days, they had to call the search off, and the assumption was, well, you're doing something dangerous. There's a reason this is off limits. He probably slipped at some point and fell down the mountain. That's why this is off limits. It's not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something in this picture. This shot looks like he's just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down a little ways down the trail that appears to be hiding. And many people believe that that guy was following Dalen and at some point attacked him. That Dalen didn't fall off the mountain, he was abducted or killed. To this day, Dalen has never been found and that mystery man has never been identified. The most remote island in the world is Bouvet Island. It is an uninhabited 19 square mile chunk of rock and ice situated in the South Atlantic. If you were looking on a map and drew a 1,000 mile radius around Bouvet Island, there would be nothing else in it. There's no land, there is nothing. In fact, the nearest land is 1,100 miles away and it's Antarctica that's not permanently inhabited. The nearest permanently inhabited land is South Africa, and that's 1,600 miles away. The island is so far away from anything that in 1979, Israel and South Africa dropped 2 nuclear bombs on it, and nobody noticed. The only reason anybody found out about it is because a US satellite happened to be looking in its direction, and it saw 2 bright flashes of light, and they were like, I wonder what that is, and then it turned out to be nuclear testing. For the very few people that have gone to Bouvet Island, you can't just take a ship there or a boat there because all around the edges of this island are these jagged ice cliffs. And then the water is treacherous down near the edge of these cliffs with very strong currents. If you were to fall in, you'd get sucked up and probably underneath some of these rocks and then you're done for. So nearly anyone who's stepped foot on Bouvet Island has taken a helicopter and flown the long, sketchy flight, hoping you don't hit a storm because you can't land anywhere. You're in the middle of nowhere with no land, all the way to Bouvet Island. And then anyone that's been on Bouvet Island only stays for like a few minutes because they're so worried about a storm rolling in. And the weather at Bouvet Island is famously bad and storms are constantly rolling in. Oh, and Bouvet Island is an active volcano. So it's this horrible place that nobody goes to or should go to. But a few people still do. In 1964, British explorer Alan Crawford was sent out to Bouvet Island with a team of scientists to inspect the northwest corner of the island where a recent lava flow had created a shelf that looked like you could potentially build a building on it. And the British wanted to stand up a weather station out there, but they needed someone to go out there and give the green light. So on April 2nd, 1964, Crawford and his crew departed South Africa and began the long helicopter ride. When they finally touched down on Bouvet Island, everybody was on edge because you are in the most remote place in the world, and if anything happens to you, there's no help coming for you. So people were eager to get the work done, survey the area, and get right back on the helicopter and leave. So the team immediately gets to work surveying the site, while Crawford decides to just for a couple minutes to step over the ridge and just look out at the island. He was fascinated with Bouvet Island and he just wanted to get a better look at it. So he walks up this embankment and he crests the hill and he looks down, and there's this little rocky alcove that he can see the water. It's at this one area of the island where there's a little bit of a beach, and he sees a wooden lifeboat that's kind of half sunken sitting in the shallow waters of this lagoon. He couldn't believe it because he knows it's not theirs because they came in on helicopter. And he's also thinking, like, how could this boat have gotten here at all? The nearest land is 1,100 miles away. So he starts walking down towards the boat and he sees on the beach 2 wooden oars that he assumes go with the boat. Next to them is a flattened copper tank that's used to catch water. And then next to that was a wooden barrel, which also would have been used to store water. He starts looking around the beach for other signs of human life, and there are none. There's no tent, there's no clothes, there's no human remains. He finally gets down to the beach and actually wades out the little ways into the water to actually inspect this lifeboat. And he starts looking for identifying marks or numbers on the boat that might give away where it's from, but there's no significant marking on the boat. It was in pretty good shape, but there was just nothing to give away where it was from. Because Crawford knew they had very little time before they were going to leave the island, he ran back on shore and he looked around on the beach some more. He walked up the hill a ways to get a look down the island to see if there's any sign of human life on this island, but there's none. And so he goes back over to his team and he tells them what he's found. But his team is so focused on getting this survey done and getting the heck out of here that they don't really care about this lifeboat. And they say, you know what, it probably washed up from some shipwreck or something. There's probably some explanation for it. Let's just get this done and get out of here. Crawford feels a little bit frustrated because he's fascinated by what he's just found and he wishes they were too. So he just walks back over the hill and he takes his camera out and he takes a picture of the lifeboat. After that, he hopped in the helicopter, flew back to South Africa, and he showed this picture to his superiors, and he was hoping they would launch some sort of investigation to see who was out there. But much like his team, who didn't care when they were already at Bouvet Island, his superiors, who were thousands of miles away from Bouvet Island, just didn't care very much about some random lifeboat on some random island in the middle of nowhere. But 2 years after Crawford's expedition, another crew was sent out to Bouvet Island to survey the lagoon where this lifeboat was found, and the crew would report that they found the lagoon, but there was no boat, there was no barrel, there was no copper tank, there was no oars, there was nothing. It was as if it was never there. So while we don't know how the boat got there or how it left or who was on the boat and where they went, what we do know is at some point, some poor soul or souls were trapped on the most isolated and wretched island in the entire world. In central Texas lies a stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It's this beautiful clear water spring that every summer when the weather gets really hot in Texas, people converge on Jacob's Well and enjoy swimming in the water. But it's not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It's for daredevils that strap scuba gear on and dive down through Jacob's Well through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 chambers. As you move from chamber 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces, and each of the chambers gets smaller and they get darker because you're losing sunlight, and they just become overall much more difficult to navigate the deeper you go. Imagine you put on your scuba gear and you hop into Jacob's Well and you start swimming straight down. Now there's going to be what looks like the floor of the well, and then at the center of it is a 10-foot wide shaft that goes straight down. And if you swim down through that, you're going to reach the first chamber, which sits at about 30 feet and goes all the way down to 55 feet. In that first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there's algae, there's wildlife, and it's where rookie scuba divers will spend their time in Jacob's Well. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it's more narrow than the very first one you went through. And that shaft, that tunnel, is actually what makes up the second chamber. And it brings you down all the way to 80 feet. So from 55 feet to 80 feet, you are in the second chamber, and it's basically a tube. Any diver that's going to be in Jacob's Well has to be aware when you are in the second chamber on your ascent to not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is this opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber into the first chamber, but it's not. It's a dead end that loops around before you hit a wall, and you gotta go all the way back out. So hopefully you have enough air at that point. The second chamber attracts novice scuba divers and intermediate scuba divers. You still have light coming in, but it's definitely more tight, it's more claustrophobic, and because of that false chimney, it's a little bit more hazardous going into the second chamber. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, which is the bottom of the second chamber, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your tanks on that will bring you into a very small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there's all the silt and loose gravel inside of the third chamber that if your fin so much as knocks it, it will float into the water and then it will blind you. The third chamber is only from 80 feet to 90 feet, so it's only 10 feet of water. Generally speaking, you only see expert divers going into the third chamber. At the bottom of the third chamber is this heavy metal grate that sits over this tiny little opening, and that is the opening to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it looks like inside of the fourth chamber because, one, as soon as you go in there, it's impossible not to kick up a ton of silt, so you're going in blind. But two, anyone that has attempted to go into the fourth chamber and maybe has been successful has died. There are literally divers that are deceased inside of the fourth chamber. And after about a dozen people died trying to get into that fourth chamber, they finally just sealed it up. But if you were to pry open that gate and go into the fourth chamber, you would have to remove your air tanks, push them into the fourth chamber, and then you'd have to wriggle your way through while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth into the fourth chamber that, again, we don't even know what's in there. In 1983, 24-year-old college students Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 p.m. They were both experienced scuba divers. They were in an advanced scuba diver class with all the certifications for that. They had dove Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water, they went through that initial shaft into the first chamber, they continued into the tunnel that was the second chamber, they wriggled their way into the third chamber, and they reached the gate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open this gate, and Richard Patton was the first one to go into the fourth chamber. He removed his tanks and pushed them inside of this opening, and then he began headfirst to slither inside of this fourth chamber opening while Clark waited. And Clark would later say that as soon as Richard had pushed his way and had actually made it into the fourth chamber, Richard comes screaming up back out of the fourth chamber. And Clark realizes that he doesn't have a mouthpiece in, he doesn't have scuba tanks on. Richard is desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold because he's dropped his tanks, and he's reaching for Clark to help him get pulled through this hole, and he can barely get out of this hole. And as soon as he gets free, Clark takes his mouthpiece off and he jams it into Richard's mouth. And so they begin buddy breathing. One guy breathes while the other guy holds his breath, and then they reverse that back and forth, back and forth. That's not something you would do on a dive for a long period of time. It's an emergency procedure, and you need to get to the surface as soon as you can. So the pair calms down, they're buddy breathing, and they're making their way back up. They're leaving the equipment that they lost in the fourth chamber, and they're kicking their way up, and they get back into the third chamber. They make their way up into the second chamber. They're kicking it out, and then their heads hit the wall. And they realize they've gone down the false chimney, and what's even worse is they hear that awful ka-thunk, which means you have no air in your tanks. Clark, who had taken a full breath before this had happened, he immediately turns and starts swimming and manages to get out of the false chimney and makes it to the surface before he drowns. But Richard wasn't as lucky. His final few moments were spent in total darkness with silt kicked up all around him. He's got no air, he's got no idea where to go, and he's desperately trying to swim up, but he keeps hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm gonna do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures. And then all of a sudden, the ground underneath him began to shift. And it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back, scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery. On July 12, 2015, 30-year-old Christopher LeCun was out on his boat with his wife, his kids, and his best friend Robert just off the coast of Port St. Lucie in Florida. Throughout the day, anytime Chris or Robert were looking down from the boat and spotted a rock pile, they would throw on their scuba tanks and dive down to attempt to find lobsters. Towards the end of the day, when they were looking down into the water, they saw what they thought was a rock pile at first, but as they kept looking at it, they noticed it had lots of straight lines, indicating it could be an underwater building. Chris and Robert noticed there was a yellow buoy floating on the surface right above where this building was underwater, and they thought they should probably go over and read it, but they decided, it's inconsequential. We can just go down and check it out for ourselves. Now, if they had stopped and gone over and read the buoy first, they would have seen there was a warning on it that was telling people to stay back at least 100 feet from this underwater structure. But Robert and Chris didn't read that warning, so they put on their scuba tanks and they dove down into the water. And after only going down about 10 feet, they noticed there wasn't just one structure underwater. There were actually 3 huge structures. And so Chris and Robert looked at each other and they're totally amazed at what they're looking at. They had been scuba diving together since they were young kids, and they'd spent a lot of time in these waters, but they had never seen these before. And so they were very excited to go down and have a look. When they got down there and they were only a couple feet away from one of these structures, Chris saw that the top of the building was just a square concrete slab, and then on all 4 sides there were big concrete slabs. But at the top of each of the 4 walls of this building were what appeared to be openings. They were almost like windows at the top of the structure. And across the window was mesh all the way around, like a grate, protecting things from going into the window and into the structure. And so Chris and Robert went right up to the mesh and tried to look inside of the structure just to see what was in there. But when they looked, it was just too dark inside and there was no way to tell what was in there. And so Chris is really disheartened because he really wanted to know what was inside of this building. And so he just grabs the mesh itself and just kind of tries to tug it in one direction just to see if it would even move, to maybe create some space so he could look inside. And it very easily slid all the way to the side, revealing an opening big enough for he and Robert to go through. And so the two of them look at each other and they just nod because they know they want to go inside and see what's in there. And so Chris went in, followed by Robert, and they found themselves inside of just this big empty space, this 70-foot by 70-foot space where there really was nothing inside of it, except down at the very bottom on one wall was this 16-foot wide opening that was the entrance to a huge tunnel. And from where Chris and Robert were at the top of the inside of the structure, they couldn't see into the tunnel. And so they decided, by looking at each other and nodding once more, that they would just go down and try to look to see if they could see through to the other side of this tunnel. And so Chris goes down first, followed by Robert, and as they start making their way down, they both start to feel a current that's pulling them straight down. And as soon as they felt that, they both intuitively knew that they didn't want to be a part of that, and they started swimming as fast as they could back up towards their exit. Robert, who was a little bit higher than Christopher, was able to escape the pull of this current and got up to the top of the inside of the structure towards the exit. Chris, on the other hand, was not able to escape this current's grasp and was actually pulled backwards into the tunnel where he disappeared. Robert had actually turned around and saw his friend get pulled into that tunnel, but he knew there was nothing he could do, and so he just turned around, swam out of the structure, and up to the boat as fast as he could to call 911. Once Chris had been pulled into this dark tunnel, he began tumbling backwards. He had no control over his body position. The current was just way too strong. And so Chris instinctively grabbed his mouthpiece and anchored it inside of his mouth, and then he grabbed his mask and did his best to keep that on his face. Because as he was tumbling, the current kept trying to pull those things off of him. As Chris tumbled through this pitch black tunnel, he began to realize that more than likely he's going to encounter some very powerful pump that's sucking this water through this pipe in the first place, or some huge turbine that has something to do with pulling the water through this pipe. And in both of those situations, once Chris reaches the end of this tunnel, he's going to get cut up and get killed. And so Chris thought about pulling his mouthpiece out to just end it right then and there to avoid this horribly violent death. But he thought about his family, he thought about his kids, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And so he just continued to hold on to his mouthpiece and his mask and just continued to tumble with no control in total darkness, having no clue where he was going. After over 5 minutes of this just nightmare situation for Chris, he suddenly sees a very small flicker of light at the very far end of the tunnel in the direction they're being pulled towards. And all he can think of is, okay, well, whatever that light is, that's the area where I'm going to get killed. There's going to be some pump or some turbine right out there. And so he's bracing himself for this terrible, violent end to his life. But as they got closer and closer and that light continued to grow, Chris got a better picture. Every time he would tumble around, he'd get a look, and it did not look like there were spinning blades of death or some pump in there. It actually looked like very peaceful, calm water with sunlight pushing through it. And sure enough, after he got shot out into this lit up area, the current kind of died down and stopped. Chris immediately began swimming right up towards the surface where there was actually land right in front of him. He was inside of what looked like this huge building, and he saw there were people walking around with hard hats. And so Chris just pulled himself out of the water and began yelling for help. It would turn out Chris had been pulled into a nuclear power plant's cooling system. This particular nuclear power plant used a multi-level system where instead of just pulling the water in directly into the plant where it would be cooled and there would be, a pump of death or spinning turbines or something like that, instead there was a reservoir first where the water was dumped, and then after a while that reservoir water would then get churned up into the cooling system. So Chris was just incredibly lucky that that was just the way this nuclear power plant was built, because many other nuclear power plants, if he had done what he did, he would have been killed in a really horrible way. Chris would ultimately sue the power plant, saying they didn't put up enough warning signs or enough deterrents to protect people from getting sucked into these intake pipes, and the power plant has countered by saying, we put up enough deterrents, you just went past them on purpose. As of now, it's unclear what came of that court case. In 1990, 46-year-old Alex Kirstich was a marine biology high school teacher by day and a documentary filmmaker by night. In July of that year, he and 3 of his friends were in Mexico working on a documentary about sea life in the Gulf of California. They had already shot a bunch of footage during the daytime, and now they needed to go out and get some nighttime footage as well. On the evening of the 25th, Alex and his 3 friends boarded a 70-foot research vessel with all of their diving and camera equipment. They waited until just before sunset to leave the harbor, and then it was a 30-minute transit to this area just north of La Paz that they had been told was very active at night. Once the ship was stopped, they threw their anchor down and then turned on these bright spotlights and aimed them into the water. And then one of the ship's crew members put a big piece of tuna onto his fishing rod and then cast it out into the water to try to lure some animals to the area. A few moments later, a black mass suddenly came up to the surface, ripped the tuna from the line, and then vanished as quickly as it appeared. Alex and his 3 friends didn't get a good look at it. They saw it happen, but they had no idea what it was. So they told the ship crew member to put another piece of tuna on the line, throw it out there, and see if they can get a better look at this thing. And so more tuna was put on the rod, it was cast out, and then seconds later, a black mass rushed up to the surface, grabbed the tuna, and then went back down again. But this time, with Alex and the others looking really intently at it, they picked up what looked like a red and white flash, like a strobe light on the skin of this creature as it descended down below. And they looked at each other and they thought, could it be? And so another piece of tuna was put on the fishing rod, they cast it out into the water, and this time, before anything could come up and take it, deep down below, they see a flash of red and white all over the place, like a bunch of strobe lights going off. And then dozens of these creatures rocketed to the surface, fought over this tuna, and then descended back down into the deep water. And so now the men look at each other and they're grinning because they know the red and white flashing they are seeing is a trademark of a very rare creature. It's their skin changing colors. It's how they communicate with each other. And this creature is so rare that at this time, no one had actually filmed it alive. There was only footage of it dead after it washed up on shore. And so suddenly Alex and his team are thinking, man, our documentary is about to become legendary if we can just get in there and get the footage. And so the men eagerly put on their dive equipment, got their cameras, and prepared to enter the water. Had they consulted with anyone who studied this rare creature, they would have been told that getting in the water with them was a horrible idea and could easily get them killed. These rare creatures are called Humboldt squids, and they are 8-foot long apex predators that live in the deepest parts of the ocean. Because they almost never come up to the shallow waters, we know very little about them. What we do know is that, like all other squids, they have 8 arms along with 2 long tentacles that have all these suckers on it, and inside of the suckers are these teeth, these little daggers that they use to latch onto their prey, and then they pull their prey in towards their center, and at their center is this opening. It's their mouth, and it's called a beak, and it literally looks like a bird's beak. It's this hard thing that sits there and opens and shuts, and they use it to bite into their prey. And then inside of their beak is their tongue, and on their tongue are hundreds of sharp little daggers like more teeth that they also use to shred their prey. Typically, these jumbo squid will sneak underneath their prey and then suddenly shoot up, grab them with their 2 tentacles, and then drag them down to the deeper water where they feel feel safe, and then they begin the horrifyingly slow process of eating their prey alive because they have a gag reflex that prevents them from eating quickly. Humboldt squids are very intelligent, they're very social, and they're very aggressive towards humans, especially when they are in a large group or when they are eating. But of course, Alex and his three friends are not thinking about this. They're just eager to get into those jumbo squid infested waters and get this footage. And so they give each other the final okays. They're ready. Their equipment's good to go. And they slip off the side of the boat into the water. Once they were in the water, they sank down to 30 feet, at which point they spread out around the squid that were still darting up to the edge of the boat to try to get more tuna. After a few minutes of Alex and his buddies taking this great footage of these squids, a 14-foot shark suddenly comes into the mix and tries to eat the tuna off the side of the boat. But ironically, on its way out after not getting any tuna, the shark got its tail fin stuck on the actual hook and then became bait for the Humboldt squids. And seconds later, these squids began ripping the shark apart. And so Alex and his three friends decided to move closer to the drama to get some great footage. As Alex is right up next to this drama unfolding, he feels himself suddenly sinking in the water. And he's kind of fixated on getting this shot, so he's not really worried about why he's sinking. He's thinking maybe my buoyancy compensator off, maybe my weights are too heavy. But when he looks down, he realizes in horror, a Humboldt squid has wrapped one of its tentacles around his right swim fin. And so he instinctively begins kicking the squid's tentacle with his left leg. He gets it to release him, and in a panic, Alex begins swimming back up towards the surface. But he's still 40 feet away at this point from the boat. And at this point, the other squid had been alerted to Alex as now being considered prey. And so as Alex is going up, from behind, another squid comes up and wraps its tentacle around his neck. And his neck was the only area on his body that was not protected by his neoprene wetsuit. And so the daggers inside of the suckers on this tentacle dug into his neck, all around his neck. So his neck's being cut into and he's being strangled and being pulled down by this squid. And so Alex begins punching and squeezing and pulling on this tentacle, fighting for his life. And he manages to get this squid, the second one, also to release him. But by now he's been pulled down to 50 feet. He's got a ways to go to get back to the boat. And the other squid are all coming over. They're converging on him because they're all communicating that here's our prey, here's our other meal. And so Alex tries to swim as fast as he can back to the boat, but he only made it a few feet before another Humboldt squid darted up and came right up to his face, wrapped both tentacles around his entire head, blinding him, and he immediately felt the beak pressed up against his face, and it was opening and closing, trying to bite him, but it was biting down on his dive mask that was basically saving him from having his skull crushed by this squid. The squid became frustrated because it's not digging into Alex's flesh, and so it readjusted its grip on him by sliding down to his midsection, where immediately it begins pulling him down violently in these pulsing bursts. And so all Alex starts doing is punching and hitting and doing everything he can to get this thing off of him. And then for some reason, it does release him. Maybe it was just so frustrated that it could not puncture into him. And so Alex is now down to about 60 feet, and he starts swimming as fast as he can with all these squids all around him. But for some reason, none of them attacked him. And so Alex swims up to the boat, and before he actually gets on board, he looks down back into the water, and there's just dozens of these squids that are flashing red and white at each other, just kind of hovering in the water, not making any move towards him. It was like they were just watching him. Alex sprinted up that ladder, got into the boat, and shortly after, his three friends came out of the water as well. They were unharmed. Alex had deep cuts all around his neck from where the tentacles had driven their teeth into his throat, but besides that, he was physically okay. Mentally, he was a train wreck and was very traumatized from this event, as you could imagine. Today, his encounter with the jumbo squids is a thing of legend in the diving